I'd like to read from Psalm 20. Psalm 20. May the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the God of Jacob set you securely on high. May he send you help from the sanctuary and support you from Zion. May he remember all your meal offerings and find your burnt offerings acceptable. Selah. May he grant you your heart's desire and fulfill all your counsel. We will sing for joy over your victory, and in the name of our God, we will set up our banners. May the Lord fulfill all your petitions. Now I know that the Lord saves his anointed. He will answer him from his holy heaven with the saving strength of his right hand. Some boast in chariots and some in horses, but we will boast in the name of the Lord our God. They have bowed down and fallen, but we have risen and stood upright. Save, O Lord, may the King answer us in the day we call. What a tremendous psalm, amen? With that being said, Michael, I'm going to turn the service over to you. And anyway, looking forward to you being a blessing to us this morning.
Well, it's good to be with you guys. I found out today that it's not Rainham, but Rainham, right?
That's what I've been told all these years. Before you get started, we're going to need to bring down, because you've got a slide presentation, sure. So we're going to need to bring the blinds down, please. Thank you.
So as they're doing that, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My wife and I have 5 kids. So a lot of people already think we're crazy for having, I think once you have over 3 kids in Massachusetts, you're crazy. But the reason that I do what I do, and I'm sure you do what you do, is because the family is so important. And that's really our main mission, is how we can strengthen and protect not just my family, but your family here in Massachusetts. And speaking of family, I'll go to the next slide. This is a picture of our family, my wife Ashley and I, and my wife couldn't be with me this morning. She's been struggling from Lyme disease, as I'm sure in a congregation this size, I'm sure there's many of you that know somebody that struggles from Lyme disease. It's been a struggle for 3.5 years, but praise the Lord, I think she's coming out of it, and appreciate your prayers for her as well, my wife Ashley. But we have 4 boys and a girl. And the oldest is Jesse, and then, well, here they go. Here they are. So if you guys can see that. So Jesse, Levi, Daisy, Judah, and Ezra. So I like to say we have an Old Testament tribe growing at home. Names are important, right? And we hope our kids live up to those names. My 2 oldest boys are on their way. They just landed in Milwaukee, visiting their cousin today, so I just heard that they just landed. So as a parent, I'm sure you guys know whenever your kids are traveling, it's nice to know they've landed safely. So today, next slide, I want to talk about our shared mission, and this is dedicated to strengthening the family and the Judeo-Christian values upon which the family is based. If you go to the next slide. And it's a nationwide partnership at MFI, so Massachusetts Family Institute is one of 40 family policy councils across the United States. So I like to say we are the Paul Reveres when it comes to religious liberty, when it comes to life, when it comes to marriage, and when it comes to the family. And so you can see some of the national partners we work with. So you might have heard of an organization called Alliance Defending Freedom. This is a group of Christian, pro bono, First Amendment attorneys that are there for your help when it comes to free speech and religious liberty concerns. So over the past 3 years, we definitely had a lot of attacks on religious liberty here in Massachusetts, especially when it came to when COVID hit in 2020, and they started locking down the church, but they kept the liquor store open. We thought that was a little discriminating. And so I'll tell you some stories actually about how we were able to fight for the liberty of the church in 2020. So just know that your First Amendment rights have a partner. If they ever come under attack, we want to know about it so we can help you. You guys might know the story of the baker in Colorado, Jack Phillips, who was forced to bake a cake for a homosexual wedding. And he said, that goes against my faith. And so they sued him, right, for not baking the cake. They could have just gone right down the road to another bakery, but they decided to sue Jack Phillips. And so Alliance Defending Freedom represented Jack Phillips at the Supreme Court. And he won his case for religious liberty. And then they sued him again because they wanted him to bake a Satanist cake. And then they also sued him again because they wanted to bake a transgender cake. So the war is always going on. But if we don't stand for those God-given rights that we've been given by our Creator, they will be taken from us. And so we want to partner with you to protect those. And then also the Family Research Council. Tony Perkins, if you're familiar with him, down in D.C., they do on a national level what we do on a state level. So it just gives you a little idea of who we partner with. We're also a local associate of Focus on the Family, and we've been in Massachusetts since 1991. So about 32 years, if I'm doing my math correct. Next slide. So we still care about the definition of marriage, right? Between one man and one woman. We believe that is the best thing for any child. Even statistically, we see even in secular studies that is the best scenario for a child growing up. And then next we see, so we care about marriage. Next slide. We care about religious liberty, as I mentioned. And next slide, we care about the sanctity of life, both at the beginning of life, of course, regarding the abortion issue, but also at the end of life regarding the assisted suicide issue as well. And I'll get into a little bit about that in Massachusetts. So next slide. I always say, well, let's start here in Matthew 18, and this will give, I think, a good additional segue into what I want to talk about in terms of the protection of our children. And Jesus says this, and it's pretty sobering words here from Jesus. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. As parents and grandparents, we have this really important responsibility to bring up our children. And I don't know if any of us have necessarily been thrown into the bottom of the sea. I'm sure all of our kids have sinned at some point. But this really is an important instruction that Jesus gives us. And I think it should put parenting and grandparenting and all these things in perspective for us. And so we want to partner with you to make sure that our kids, especially when it comes to what's going on in our public schools, as I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are aware of a lot of the nonsense going on in our schools today, that we want to be able to give you guys resources to protect your children from all those different influences. Next slide. And then just another verse here out of 1 John, for whatsoever is born of God overcometh the world, and this is the victory that overcometh the world, even our faith. I think a lot of times in Massachusetts we feel overwhelmed, we feel alone as Christians. But I want you guys to know this morning that you're not alone, and you're not crazy for having a biblical understanding of the world. Next slide. So I mentioned you're not alone. I've had the privilege of traveling all across Massachusetts, speaking at churches. I've probably spoken at about 200 different churches in Massachusetts over the past 7 years. And I am convinced that you are not alone in Massachusetts. People tell us in New England, we are the most, even in Massachusetts, we're the most unchurched part of the country, other than maybe, the San Francisco area. But I will tell you that there are many churches in Massachusetts. If you ask the Secretary of State's office how many places of worship there are in Massachusetts, you'll find out that there's 8,000 places of worship. in Massachusetts. Just in the city of Lawrence, Massachusetts, up 93 north, going towards New Hampshire, there's over 100 Hispanic churches just in Lawrence. In Worcester, where we've done a lot of good work, just on Main Street in Worcester, there's 30 to 40 Hispanic churches, just on that one street. The immigrant church in Massachusetts, who we partner with a lot, is very alive and well in the state. And I'll show you some pictures of that as well. So next slide. I just want to show you some of the places that I've been, just to kind of give a picture can tell 1,000 words, right? So there's Jubilee. This is in Boston, one of the largest churches in Massachusetts with about 5,000 people. Did you guys know there was a 5,000 member church in Massachusetts, right? Next slide. I mentioned the 100 churches in Lawrence. So this church is called Ebenezer, and this is the mother church of those 100 churches in Lawrence. I think I've spoken at this church 5 different times. Next slide. This is a church with over 1,000 members in Lynn. Did you guys know there was a 1,000-member church in the city of Lynn? I didn't. And I showed up at this church. It was just a brick building from the outside on Union Street, and I go in downstairs, and there's this huge auditorium, as you can see. Next slide. Here's another great church, the Evangelical Free Church in Westfield, Massachusetts. Next slide. I always like this one. This is an 800-member Russian Pentecostal church. Did you guys know there were Russian Pentecostals? I had no idea.
I guess they speak in tongues.
Yeah, that's right. I had no idea. And 800 people. I've spoken at this church twice in Westfield, Massachusetts. And now this church, because of the influence we've had with them, they've started a Christian school. Next slide. There's actually a huge Slavic population in western Massachusetts that emigrated here in the early 2000s. This was an event in Marlborough, Massachusetts, where 5 Hispanic churches came together, and there were over 3,000 in attendance. Next slide. A great church in Uxbridge, Nazarene Church there. Next slide. A great Catholic church. I actually spoke at Mass twice here in Massachusetts at 2 different Catholic churches. Next slide. Here is a Ukrainian church in West Springfield. This church used to be a Big Y supermarket, and they transformed it into a church. Spoken here probably 3 times. Next slide. And I've been translated into Russian and I guess Ukrainian as well when I spoke. Here's a great church, Legacy, another Slavic church out in Chicopee. Next slide. A great church in Hamden, Massachusetts, that I've spoken at a couple times, out in the western part of the state. Next slide. Here is the largest Hispanic church in Worcester called New Life. They just started a Christian homeschool co-op. I'll talk more about this. Last year they had 3 kids. This year they have 60 kids at their homeschool co-op. Largest Hispanic church in Worcester. Next slide. Great Ugandan church in Stoneham, Massachusetts. Next slide. A couple more here. This is a great Hispanic church in Waltham that we've partnered with on several things. And next slide. Another great Hispanic church here in Waltham as well. I'll tell you a quick fun story. So you guys ever heard about crashing a wedding? Right? Well, what we did in Waltham with these Hispanic churches, back in 2016, Massachusetts passed recreational marijuana, right? And we were concerned about an addiction epidemic for our young people especially. And so what we did, we had 3 Hispanic churches that we were partnering with in Waltham, and Waltham would be a great location for a pot shop. And so in our efforts with these 3 churches, if you go to the next slide, this picture on the top right-hand side shows us basically crashing a how to open a pot shop meeting that was happening on a Thursday night in Waltham. Back in 2017, they had no idea that we were coming. There were 100 of us. So if you can imagine, right now, if 100 people came in this door and just sat amongst us, would that be a little intimidating? Right? Well, that's exactly what we did at this How to Open a Pot Shop meeting. And because of our efforts, there are no recreational pot shops in Waltham to this day, since 2016. I talked about those churches in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Lawrence was the first city in Massachusetts to completely ban recreational marijuana shops. I don't know if you guys knew that or not. But the first city in Massachusetts to do that. And it was because of these Hispanic churches. Actually, I showed up with them at the city council meeting in July of 2017. We got a 9-0 decision from the city council in Lawrence when 200 of us showed up and said no to recreational marijuana. Now we say that God made the plant and man has a way of manipulating something that the Lord, perhaps meant for good. So I know, that there's a lot of different thoughts around this issue, but again, for us, it was a youth addiction epidemic that we were concerned about, and we were so glad to see at least 100 out of the 351 towns and cities in Massachusetts ban recreational marijuana on a local level. So I don't know if you guys knew that or not, but the industry thought this would be a slam dunk in Massachusetts, and because of the church, especially because of the Hispanic church, it was a slow rollout. So I hope you're encouraged by that even in Massachusetts, you're not alone on different issues. And, I know not every Sunday morning we talk about drugs at church, but when it comes to keeping our kids from these different temptations that are out there, we want to help the church and the family protect our children. Next slide. So I want to talk about some victories we had for religious liberty and speech, First Amendment rights, especially in the last 3 years. I always say in 2020, we saw 2020, if you get what I'm saying. That there was a lot of discrimination going on that perhaps was unclear at the beginning, but became more clear as we progressed. Next slide. So in Worcester, there was this Pastor Casey, and he has a church called Adams Square Baptist Church on Lincoln Street. And across from his church was a liquor store. Of course, the liquor store was open, and his church was being told he had to close his doors. So, what do you think Pastor Casey did? Well, he kept his doors open, of course. And he was criminally charged 3 times. But he saw exactly what we saw. The abortion clinic was open, the marijuana shop was open, the liquor store was open. But the church, who has protected rights, God-given rights under the First Amendment, not the 10th Amendment, the 9th Amendment, the 8th Amendment, the First Amendment, that the church was being told that it had to shut down. So we provided an attorney for Pastor Casey, and long story short, is that he, like I said, was criminally charged 3 times. He ended up suing the governor of Massachusetts, like every good pastor should do, sue the governor. And he ended up winning. Now, I don't know if you guys knew that story or not. I'm sure the Boston Globe didn't have an article on it, or any of the mainstream. But because of Pastor Casey, and then next slide, also we had over 500 pastors in Massachusetts sign a letter to the governor saying that the church is essential, because we were getting the message at the time that you were not essential, right? But we said, wait a minute, the church is very essential. And so those 2 things really helped, if you go to the next slide, get the church in Massachusetts reopened in not phase 2, not phase 3, not phase 4, not phase 5, but phase 1. I believe we were the only blue state to open up the church in phase 1 during COVID. So you should be encouraged by that here in Massachusetts, we set the example. Well, another great story down not too far from here in New Bedford, there's a church called New Life South Coast. They renovated a Shaw's supermarket. And they were told by New Bedford that you could only have 100 or less people. But when you went to go shop at Shaw's for bread, there was no minimum limit. So we had this story, well, okay, if you're going to go shop for bread, there's no limit. But if you're going to go worship the bread of life at what used to be a Shaw's supermarket, all of a sudden there's a limit. And so we filed a federal lawsuit, didn't even go to court because they knew they had no case. And that was the actual lawsuit that opened up churches at 100% capacity. So I don't know if you guys read that story in the mainstream media, but I'm here to let you know 3 years later. Next slide. There's a church in Somerville, the largest Hispanic church in Somerville, called Vida Real, Pastor Morales. And if you guys can picture with me, it was 11 o'clock service, Pastor Morales giving the sermon, and unannounced, the Board of Health director comes down the center aisle, tells Pastor Morales to put his mask on. Now, during that time, the guidelines had clearly said that if you're a pastor or if you're singing up on stage, you don't have to wear a mask. So Pastor Morales, because we knew each other, he pulled his phone out and he started filming the entire thing. Well, guess what else happened? 7 police officers came unannounced with the Board of Health director into the service. Now, can you imagine if 7 police officers came in this service right now? Would that be a little disruptive? Might you feel a little uncomfortable? Well, a lot of these people got out of their seats and there was chaos. So Pastor Morales calls me that afternoon. He says, Mike, I need some help. So we said, well, we provide that kind of help. So that Monday, less than 24 hours later, we had 2 attorneys from Texas and Virginia fly up, met with him and the Board of Health that Tuesday, and they apologized to the pastor. But without that help, without Pastor Morales standing up for his God-given rights, those would have been compromised. And next slide, here's a great picture of Pastor Morales. He's actually now on our board, which is great. We're making these wonderful relationships with pastors across the state. Next slide. Also, I want you to know, in our K through 12 private and public schools, so here in Rainham, public schools, also private schools, okay, K through 12, and then also colleges and universities, that there is a bill at your state house that they want to take away your religious exemption when it comes to vaccines. And we believe that every parent, child, should be able to decide what goes in their body. You should make that decision for your child. Well, the government in here in Mass wants to make that decision for you. And take away, like I said, your religious exemption. Well, we've been fighting this, and I just want to encourage you that at one of the last hearings on this, next slide, there were 400 people that showed up to testify, which is a huge number if you've ever been to a hearing at the State House. And over 90%, I'd say actually over 95%, agreed with us that we should be able to preserve that religious exemption and say, look, I have a religious concern here, or whatever the concern is, right, regarding what goes in my body, and that I shouldn't be precluded from going to school, even at a private school, because of my conviction. So just so you know, again, you're not alone. Next slide. This is a really great story. Rochester, you guys know where Rochester, Mass is? A little farther south, right, on the Rhode Island border. So at the library in Rochester, and you might see these sometimes, you see these little libraries that show up outside of our libraries, you know, these little boxes, if you will, and there's some books in there, right? So at the Rochester Library, there was this little diverse library. Now, if you've been following the news about what's been showing up in our school libraries, a lot of inappropriate books, right, are showing up in our school libraries. And when we bring it up, you know, the other side of this issue is saying, well, you just want to ban books. No, we just don't want inappropriate books in the classroom. And so there were inappropriate books in this diverse library. So one of the citizens of Rochester said, well, I would like to construct the Little Freedom Library and put it right next to the Little Diverse Library. And we'd like to have the Constitution in there and some other historical and appropriate books for children. So we wrote a letter, a legal letter, to the library trustees and said, look, you either have to let the Little Freedom Library exist, or you have to take down the Little Diverse Library. You can't discriminate viewpoint. So what ended up happening is they met, and I guess they so didn't want the Little Freedom Library that they took down the Little Diverse Library. So there's no longer a Little Diverse Library in Rochester, Massachusetts. Next slide. You guys might have heard of this guy, very, very close here, Middleborough, I think a neighboring town, if I'm not mistaken. I was reading the signs as I came down 24. Liam Morrison, you guys might have heard that name, 12-year-old boy, Middleborough Middle School. He wore a shirt to school that said there are only two genders. Now, that caused a ruckus, and the principal came up to Liam and said, Liam, you got to take that shirt off. It is causing physical harm to the students. Can you imagine? We live in a time where that kind of statement, there are only two genders, is causing physical harm. So Liam says, well, I'm not going to take it off, and he actually said that a lot of his friends agreed with his statement on his shirt. So the principal sent him home. Well, within a week, Liam goes back to school with a very similar message on his shirt, and the principal once again says, Liam, you got to take your shirt off, and Liam again says, no. And so the principal sends him home. Well, like I said, we offer First Amendment support for people that are going through these issues of free speech and religious liberty. And so now we're partnering with Alliance Defending Freedom, the same organization that represented Jack Phillips at the Supreme Court. And we are now appealing his case because, if you can believe it, we lost on a state level in terms of his ability to speak this way. It's going to the First Circuit in Boston, and if it doesn't win there, we're very hopeful that it'll make its way to the Supreme Court, and we'll have a victory for speech, for free speech and religious conviction coming out of Massachusetts, of all places. So be praying for Liam, brave 12-year-old boy in the Middleborough Middle School. Next slide. You might have heard this story. A good friend of mine, Hal Shurtleff, who's the director of Camp Constitution, he wanted to fly the Christian flag at the Boston City Hall, right? Did you guys hear this story at all? Right? And Boston, if you know the story, then you'll know that Boston flew 284 flags, including the Chinese Communist flag and the transgender flag, from the city flagpole. Never said no to anybody. But when Hal goes and says, I'd like to fly the Christian flag, well, Boston says no. And so Liberty Counsel, another organization that we partner with, represented Hal eventually at the Supreme Court. And they got a 9-0 decision at the Supreme Court because Boston was so discriminatory that even the judges that don't agree with our worldview on the Supreme Court voted with us. It was that egregious. And now, next slide, we're seeing this decision have an effect in many schools across Massachusetts. Stoughton, Dighton, Rehoboth, Dedham and other schools now have removed all pride flags from their schools because there can be no political bias now. If you're not going to allow the Christian flag, well, you shouldn't allow any flag except the American flag, state flag, and in some places when the Red Sox win, the Red Sox flag. And if the Patriots ever win again, the Patriots flag. Just goes to show how important Tom Brady was, right? Anyway, that's a discussion for another time. So the natural family flag in Fitchburg, another great result of this decision. There was a homeschool mom in Fitchburg that wanted to fly the natural family flag. Now, have you guys ever heard? Did you guys know there was a natural family flag? I never knew it even existed. But she was successful, long story short, in getting the natural family flag to fly. And the mayor of Fitchburg even took a picture with the flag which was great. So we were just glad to see people standing up and saying, look, I'm going to celebrate family. They just raised the pro-life flag in Billerica, Massachusetts. Did you guys know there's a pro-life flag? They just raised the pro-life flag for half of October in Billerica. Next slide. So, and I mentioned this too about some of the schools now that are removing pride flags because a lot of our schools already have policies that say there can be no political bias at your school. So let's just get back to reading, writing, and arithmetic. Wouldn't that be great? Right? So are you a little encouraged? Right? Maybe you didn't hear these stories other places, but that's why we have to travel around Massachusetts and make sure you know. Next slide. And I mentioned too this pro-life flag flies in Billerica. That was a great story. I was just in Billerica 2-3 weeks ago when we raised this flag together. Next slide. If you go to the next slide, we'll go forward. Here we go. You guys, I'm sure, have heard of this thing called the Drag Queen Storytime Hour, right? It's been all over the news. Well, we've been encouraging pastors and families to host pastor story hours and family story hours and such. And so in all of these towns, we've seen pastor story hours, more than just these towns. In Taunton, there is a church called the Broken Chains Biker Church. I don't know if you guys have heard of this church or not. But the Broken Chains Biker Church has been hosting a pastor story hour at the Taunton Library. So if you guys ever want to go for a great story hour with them, Taunton's not too far from here. But we were just so encouraged. There was a pastor in Chelmsford that hosted a story hour, and the book was Jesus and Your Gender Identity. And I saw the book and I said, oh, he's going to get canceled. And I called him that week. I said, if you get canceled, call me because we'll support you. And so wouldn't you know it, 24 hours before his story hour, he gets canceled by the library. And so he called. I said, I already know what you're going to say. And so we got our attorneys right on it. And within 8 hours of him calling us, we got his story hour reinstated at the Chelmsford Library. And they had about, I want to say, 50 kids and adults show up for their story time. So again, that relationship is so important between us and you and pastor churches, because that story hour never would have gotten reinstated. Those kids would never have had the opportunity to hear that book, right? And so it is so important that you guys know you have that support. Next slide. There's a lawsuit in Ludlow, Massachusetts, in the western part of the state regarding parental rights. And as grandparents and parents, you guys should realize and know, what your rights are as parents. And in the Ludlow schools, Johnny was going to school, and the school influenced him to become Jenny, right? We're hearing a lot of this in the news, right? About a 12-year-old kid. And what happened was the school had a policy that said, we're not going to tell the parents when there's a gender transition. And so we said, that's not right. Every parent should know what's going on at school, especially when it comes to gender transition. If there's no such thing in terms of my personal view, okay, but I believe Genesis 1:27, God made them male and female, and we should follow the Creator's advice on this one. But anyway, we had a federal lawsuit in Ludlow, lost at the state level, if you can believe it. It's being appealed to the First Circuit, and there's a good chance this will probably make it again to the Supreme Court. And again, a victory for parental rights eventually coming out of Massachusetts, of all places. So if you guys know parents that are struggling with this and their rights are being violated in this way, definitely reach out to us. Next slide. So Victory for Life, I want to encourage you with this in Massachusetts. You guys are familiar with pregnancy resource centers, I'm sure. Next slide. Well, we've had 3 great victories for pregnancy resource centers in Massachusetts. There are people on our city councils that want to fine pregnancy care centers for false advertising practices. Now, what are false advertising practices? Well, basically, they're telling pregnancy resource centers that if you offer a pregnancy test but don't offer abortion, so you offer a pregnancy test, which is a reproductive health care, but you don't offer the reproductive health care of an abortion, you are somehow tricking women that come into your pregnancy resource center. Well, that's like saying if you went to Chick-fil-A and you wanted to buy a hamburger, that Chick-fil-A was somehow tricking you. Well, I think all of us know that Chick-fil-A does not sell hamburgers, right? I mean, no one in here has ever gotten a good hamburger at Chick-fil-A. But that was the case they were trying to make towards pregnancy resource centers, that you are tricking people. And so we stood up for pregnancy resources, long story short, in Worcester, in East Hampton, and Framingham. No super conservative cities in Massachusetts, and we won in all 3 cities for pregnancy resource centers. So again, it's so important that we have that relationship to stand for life, because these women, especially in that are going through this struggle of perhaps an unwanted pregnancy, need to have that resource of a pregnancy resource center to save that child. And so we want to partner with you on that as well. Next slide. This just says Framingham, and next slide, Worcester as well. Worcester is the 2nd largest city in all of New England. So it really was such an encouraging victory there in Worcester. Next slide. And then I mentioned, when we talk about life, it's not just the beginning of life we're concerned about, but the end of life. And so your State House, again, just had a hearing on the assisted suicide issue. And especially for our elderly and for our disabled, this is a very slippery slope. When you start to devalue life, right, where statistically, a lot of times they'll say, well, people are in so much pain at the end of their life, and they don't talk a whole lot about the hospice care and the palliative care that we do offer. But if you look statistically, the reason that people, where this is legal, want to take their life is because they feel like they're a burden on their family. And we don't want to create policy that now feeds more into that ideology where, okay, now I'm one of that 25% feels I'm a burden. It would be so easy if I could just take a pill and end this life. But I don't think that's how the Creator values life. And this is a really, tough issue for so many people. I mean, even in my own life, going through an issue where my wife has been so ill for 3.5 years. And she's had those times, having 5 kids and feeling like she's a burden. I mean, many times she's said this. And it's so difficult for her especially to go through this process. Now she's, almost 40, but, to have people, again, in the later parts of life that this would just be an easy way out, right? That's not how we should be valuing life. And so please join us on this effort. Like I said, there was just a hearing on this at the State House. And so this could come up for a vote in the next year or so. So again, why we're passing out, to leave your cell phone, leave your email address, is so that we can stay in touch on these issues. And that we also have some legislative briefs here that will explain in more detail how we are addressing this issue. So be sure to take that before you leave. Next slide. So lastly, have you ever asked the question, what is going on in our public schools? And why have we drifted from reading, writing, and arithmetic to all of the wokeism? Well, I want to encourage you that we have been doing some really great work with advocates in many different towns and cities to protect our children. Next slide. In our schools, they are redefining a lot of things. And one of those things is abstinence. Now, you and I know that abstinence, the definition of abstinence is to abstain, and it works 100% of the time, right? And it's a good thing, right? But this is how they're describing abstinence in our public schools. Next slide. That as long as it's safe, it's okay. And so you see the top line. This is actually an 8th grade curriculum from Planned Parenthood. Okay, it's called Get Real, and it's in many of our town and city curricula. Okay, And so you can see all the different options that kids have, and this is being explained as normal. At the top line, it does say stop, abstinence, but then you have all these other things, including something called the depot shot. The depot shot is 3 months of birth control that is shot into a 12-year-old girl's arm, many times without parental consent. But if that same 12-year-old girl goes and wants a Tylenol for a headache, you know what she needs? You know what she absolutely needs at school? It's parental consent. And so we want to definitely educate parents to know exactly what's going on at school. Because so many of our schools now have these health clinics, right? That this is where a lot of this stuff is happening. So if you were concerned about that, well, there's a whole nother page if you go to the next slide. And again, this is 8th grade normalizing this kind of behavior. Next slide. And then also, as you know, redefining gender. If you go to the next slide, these are the curricula that are showing up in our public schools, something called the gender-bred person, that your sex and your gender are completely not related to each other. Your sex is what you think you are. Your gender is what you think you are. Your sex is attached to your anatomy, okay? Now, that's not medically accurate, but this is what's being normalized in the public school. And 20% of Gen Z is now questioning their gender. Next slide. If you were concerned about that, this is happening in preschool. 4-year-olds are getting the gender unicorn. And this is showing up in many, I would even say most, of our public schools. Next slide. This is a high school curricula on gender identity, and it comes from something called the Trevor Project. The guy that's in charge of this, or used to be in charge of this, was the luggage thief. You guys know Sam Brenton, the luggage thief that maybe a year ago was arrested for stealing luggage in Las Vegas or somewhere. Well, he was the guy that was promoting this in our public schools. And you can see at the top, it says, our sexuality and gender identity are not set in stone. In fact, people's identities can be fluid. The spectrum can help you visualize how you feel at any given time. Mark how you identify today on each line. But don't feel limited. It's okay to mark something different tomorrow. Now, as a church, we can't just put our head in the sand and pretend this isn't happening, right? Because too many of our kids are being confused. You know, I was just listening to a pastor from Florida. He was encouraged to run for mayor of his city in Florida. Well, he ran for mayor, he won, and then and then 6 of his deacons became heads of the commissions in the city in Florida. Now, 9 out of 12 of the commissions are headed by people in the church. So basically, the church is running the city in Florida. I just think that's a great example about how, you know, the church can really take back these levers of power, and somehow we bought into this separation of church and state, and we should have no involvement. We've really created a vacuum, and you can see what's taken our place as we've taken our hands off the wheel. So get involved, and I want to encourage you the ways that we are getting involved. Next slide. First, before I get to that, so this is a statistic you'll never hear in your public school, but 98% of children who struggle with their sex as a boy or a girl come to accept their sex by adulthood. But what we're doing is we're giving kids puberty blockers, testosterone for girls at age 12, and we're not letting them go through puberty. But we know statistically that if we let them go through puberty, 98% will feel comfortable in their anatomical skin once they reach adulthood. That is what I call abuse, and that we cannot tolerate that in our public schools. Next slide. Many doctors are telling parents, if you don't let your child transition, your child will take his or her life. That's horrible medical advice. Statistically, what we know is that kids that have the reassignment surgery are 20 times more likely to take their life. And so now we have this huge community coming out called detransitioners. I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with a girl named Chloe Cole and others that are coming out now and saying, my teacher told me the same thing, my peers told me the same thing, my doctor told me the same thing, my therapist, my guidance counselor, everybody said that I need to have the surgery. And then mom and dad were just so overwhelmed by all the voices. And so Chloe Cole, if you know the story, she had perfectly healthy, her top was removed. Another detransitioner here in Massachusetts had both top and bottom removed. Now she's traveling with us to tell the truth about this. She just met with us in Foxborough and we had a really wonderful time influencing young people regarding this issue. Next slide. So if you know how to text a keyword to our short code 87891 and you want some great talking points, you can also get them here at the table. I encourage you this morning to text the word gender to our short code 87891 because this is rampant in our schools, rampant. I mean, pretty much every school is teaching this stuff about gender identity, and it's just unacceptable. Next slide. On the education piece, I mentioned these inappropriate books that are showing up in our school libraries. We've been doing some work on this, but if you have kids in the public school, you should know, next slide, that the schools many times are promoting this app called the Sora app. And you are not getting a username and password, but your kid is, and they can access all kinds of inappropriate books on the app. So just know, you do all that you can at home to protect your kids from what they see on the internet, but the school is giving them a portal to stuff that's just as inappropriate. Next slide. These are some of the books that you'll find. The most banned book is on here, Gender Queer, and others that would be highly inappropriate. Next slide. So be encouraged. I hope I didn't depress some of you going through some of that, but be encouraged that, we've been doing some good work, having some good victories, and I think if we work together, especially with the church, we can protect our children. And we are doing that. Next slide. In Worcester, I mentioned the second largest city in all of New England. Back in 2019, I showed up with 80 people to a school committee meeting. I took some pictures that night, and that night, long story short, is we defeated the sex ed program that Planned Parenthood wanted to introduce into the Worcester Public Schools. Now, Planned Parenthood continued to fight, and so in 2021, they promoted another curriculum called the 3 R's, not reading, writing, arithmetic, rights, respect, responsibility. And we told them, look, if you pass this, you'll spark the largest opt-out movement of sex ed in the history of Massachusetts. Well, that's not only what happened, they sparked the largest opt-out movement in the history of our nation, I believe. And last year, if you go to the next slide, well, here's some more pictures, I think, of that evening. It was a packed house. Again, 80 of us made a difference in a city of hundreds of thousands. Next slide. Another picture, and then next slide. Last year, we had, one more. We had 4,000 students opt out of sex ed. That's almost 20% of the entire K-12 school in Worcester said, we're out of this class, and they went to the library. That's powerful. I mean, imagine if this whole half just got up and left, right? That would send a message to you, right? And so that's what we're seeing in Worcester, of parents taking that simple step to get their kids out of sex ed. Next slide. Sex ed mandate, you can get information on that here at the table. I won't go too far in it just for time. Next slide. You can skip that one too. But a lot of great stuff going on. I'll tell you this quick story. The MIAA, Massachusetts Interscholastic Athletic Association, this is the sports association in Massachusetts. Now, many of you probably know student athletes in our public schools in Massachusetts. Well, they were telling every student athlete that you had to sign the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Pledge. I'm sure you guys have heard these terms, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Pledge, in order to play a sport. Now, we said that's compelled speech. You can't force a student to speak in a certain way, to force them to sign a pledge in order to play a sport. And so our attorneys got in touch with the MIAA, and we said, look, this is compelled speech. It's a violation of every kid's First Amendment right. And they agreed with us, actually. And so they started to cancel, we started to see this come down. One recent story was in Newburyport, of all places, known as a conservative city in Massachusetts. Well, parent complained about it to us. We got in touch, said you can't do it. They took it down off their website. Now, why are we so concerned about this? Well, I'm sure you guys heard the story of Leah Thomas at the University of Pennsylvania, this man that is swimming against women. And when he swims against women, he comes in first, but when he swims against men, he comes in about 500th, right? But this is not fair to women. And it's not biological by any means either. And so if you go to the next slide, this is what the pledge looked like. And it says here, number 8 was what we were concerned about. And it says, support the diversity, equity, inclusion, sportsmanship, and game officials, committees, policies, programs in the MIAA and all school functions. Now, you might look at that as a parent. You've got all kinds of stuff to do. Many times we're just checking a box, get them registered, let's do the sports thing. But you don't necessarily understand that when you sign this, you're saying you're okay with Leah Thomas being on your girls' swim team. And that could create a slippery slope, right? Where the school's like, well, you guys signed it, you must think it's okay, and then we normalize this kind of behavior. So again, we want to work with you to make sure that we're not normalizing such behavior. Next slide. So be encouraged that that pledge is no longer required in Massachusetts. I'll skip over this one, Victory and Reuben. There's just a lot of victories I could tell you about, but I just don't have the time to talk about everything. So lastly, on this education piece, churches are stepping up to the plate and providing an alternative to the public school that is academic and that is affordable. I want to tell you some encouraging stories because many kids are exiting our public schools. There is what we call a public school exit going on, not only in Massachusetts, but across the nation. There's a huge education freedom movement, if you're not aware. Like if you move to Arizona tomorrow, did you know that your kid could get a $7,000 scholarship, universal school voucher, okay? And if your kid's in an IEP, it'd be a $12,000 school voucher. So like me, I got 5 kids, right? So if I move to Arizona all of a sudden, that's a $35,000 raise, if you will, just to move across state lines that I can put toward homeschooling and private schooling, right? That's just one example. Well, we don't have school vouchers here in Massachusetts, and so we're telling the church, you need to be the school voucher, right? And so these learning centers are expanded homeschool co-ops, the return of the little house on the prairie one-room schoolhouse that educated so many of our forefathers, right? And so now we are seeing, if you go to the next slide, we're seeing more and more of this going on. It might surprise you that in 2020, we saw an 800% increase in homeschooling in Massachusetts. Went from 1.5% to 12.1% of parents that are saying, all right, I'm taking back the education of my children. Next slide. So where are we seeing this? Well, there's a learning center that popped up in Westfield. Remember the Russian Pentecostal church I was telling you about? Well, just down the street from them is a church called New Life. They started a learning center. Again, this is an expanded version of a homeschool co-op, okay? It's parent-directed learning. It is not a school, so there's no requirement to get the approval of the school committee. It is a ministry of the church. It is a homeschool co-op. This one meets 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. They do K4 through 12th grade. Full scope and sequence of material for curriculum. They're able to do this for $500 per family per year. So who needs a school voucher when the church can step up? Because churches have 2 things. They have space and they have people. And those are the 2 things mainly that you need when you're going to do something like this. And I imagine even in this room, there's probably some retired teachers in here, right? And so what we're seeing across the state is grandma and grandpa taking back the one-room schoolhouse. And I think there's a lot of grandparents that would love to participate in a ministry that says, you know what? I love the fact that I can teach history this week to 5 kids and teach it with a biblical worldview. So think about that. I gave the same message in Plymouth at a church called New Hope Chapel on May 1st, 2022. By September, they had their learning center up and running with 27 students. So this isn't something that is a heavy lift like starting a school. This is a homeschool co-op. I told you next slide about the story in Worcester. It's called Grow. This is the largest Hispanic church in Worcester. Again, last year they had 3 kids. This year they have 60 kids. The Real Life Learning Center, great Christian school. I remember Luis Morales, the cops came into his service, right? They started a Christian school in Somerville. Next slide. So if you're at all interested, again, you can pick up material here on the different school options. If you're tech savvy on your phone, you can text the word school option to 87891 and get some links to the different options that we've provided and also that are just all around. There's so many great Christian schools in Massachusetts as well. So check that out. Next slide. If you're interested in starting a learning center here at the church, you can text the word POD to 87891 or talk to me afterwards, and I can fill you in more about what churches are doing on this. Next slide. If you want to go online and learn more about what's going on in our public schools, if you're on Facebook, I encourage you to join a Facebook page called Massachusetts Informed Parents. Very informative. There's about 11,000 parents on that Facebook page now. In Massachusetts. And you can go to our website, next slide, mafamily.org, and pick up a bunch of the materials. Please take as much of this here this morning. And please, if you haven't left your cell phone and email address before leaving, please do so. You know that Russian Pentecostal church I keep bringing up? You know, I spoke there about 3 or 4 years ago. 800 members. 295 people left their cell phone and email address that morning. Pretty much every family left there. It just shows how hungry they were to say, hey, we don't know what's going on in America, but this is not what we signed up for. So be encouraged by that. So as I started, I hope that you are encouraged. I hope that you know that you're not alone and you're not crazy for having a biblical understanding of education, of life, of liberty, and these different things that we're fighting for. So I hope that you guys will continue to partner with us to do this really important work. Can we close our time in prayer? Lord, I thank you for this time that you've given us this morning to fellowship and to learn about the ways, Lord, that we can have victory. Lord, you dwell in the affairs of men, Lord. You dwell in the affairs of our government. You dwell in the affairs of our schools. You dwell in the affairs of our churches. Lord, all of these things you are Lord of. And Lord, I pray that we would not be driven by a spirit of the fear of man, but we'd be driven by the fear of you. And Lord, I pray that you'd help us as parents and grandparents as we raise these children, even to our neighbors, Lord, that may not know you or may know you and are just need help. Lord, that we would protect these children. Because we're reminded of what you say, that better to have a millstone tied around our necks and thrown in the bottom of the sea than to cause one of these little ones to sin. So help us, Lord, in that important responsibility as we parent our children. Lord, forgive us of the times that we've fallen short, Lord. But as we move forward, give us a fresh vision. Give us your wisdom, energy to fight for the hearts and minds and souls of our children. Pray these things in Jesus' name.